CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Northwestern Ohio, and he's the founder of the Blue Force Mobile Training Team. Before moving to the private sector, Dr. Whitfield served as a team leader and senior instructor on a Department of Defense contract and conducted numerous training missions for the United States Army Intelligence Center of Excellence Training Division. His previous work experience included more than 26 years of law enforcement, where he served as a police officer and later a police commander. Dr. Whitfield still serves the law enforcement community today as a special deputy. His educational background consists of a Ph.D. in criminal justice, a master's degree in criminal justice administration, and a master's of business administration specializing in human resource management. The purpose of his qualitative research study for his Ph.D. was to examine how implicit bias training influences individuals' awareness, knowledge, and skills in the cultural competency. He also regularly attends advanced levels of training and seminars throughout the year. Welcome very much, Marvin, to our club, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Get started here. Okay, everybody should be able to see the screen okay? So I like to, when I'm doing this form of say training for training purposes, I like to call it a discussion. When discussing human behavior, you kind of want to limit doing it in a presentation, traditional presentation format or training environment because of the fact of everybody have different perspectives. And I never want anybody to get the impression that they're being judged during this discussion. And it's all about bringing about more awareness of how you perceive and receive information and how you view other people. And so one of the titles I could use in some form of my training is it me or am I being biased? In other words, when you see a person, place, or thing through a negative lens without ever having experience or having working knowledge, is it just you with a valid perception based on lived and learned experiences, or maybe it's implicit bias because of the lack of understanding or information? One quote I love, you see in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, is, "We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are." And as we go further to the conversation, you'll see, well, I love that quote. So the discussion is going to center around a couple of key points. I want to help increase your understanding of implicit bias, which is going to bring about awareness. I want to increase your ability to identify personal bias, which increase your knowledge. I want to give you different strategies on how to manage your biases, which then in turn increase your skills. So those are three key components of what we call cultural competency: awareness, knowledge, and skills. Once you become aware that implicit bias exists, you'll be more aware of what you say and how you interact with others. Once you gain the knowledge of other cultures and expand your cultural competency, you'll be more sympathetic and empathetic when dealing with individuals, or when you see certain events take place within our media or within your workspace. You'll have better skill sets to confront it, which comes to the last core piece. With knowledge comes the ability to have the skills on how to interact or maneuver. This here discussion is really designed to help you manage your biases, not eliminate them. Okay, it's impossible. When I did our research, the closest any research ever come to removing implicit bias was during a sleep study that took place approximately 6 months. And they took the IAT test, which is the implicit association test, which is given by Harvard University to measure your levels of biases in different areas. And they took a pre-test, and they had certain biases within race, gender, and age. And after 6 months of during a sleep study with being inundated with information, each month the bias dropped. As soon as individuals was released out of the program, but still monitored, within 2 to 3 months, their biases increase. So it's, implicit bias management is an ongoing process of continuous education. So what is bias? It's not a bad thing, okay? We all have them. There's good biases and there are bad biases. I tell individuals that a bad bias is when your implicit bias dictates your decision-making process that in turn have a negative impact on other people. That's when it becomes bad. There are also good biases. If you're walking down a dark alley in a city you're not familiar with, you're most likely, if it's a shortcut to your hotel, your bias is going to tell you, don't want to go down that dark alley, you don't feel comfortable. So that's a good bias. It's almost a bias, sometimes almost instinctive. It's just a problem when it's negative towards other individuals due to lack of information. It's basically how we perceive other cultures and races. The biggest negative component when you look at across all spectrums is when it applies to culture and race. That's where our biggest biases truly exist and have negative impacts on other individuals. What impacts your bias is just basically your lifetime experiences, how you're influenced by other persons, your exposure to people, television, newspaper, magazines, and the like. Like I said, a lot of people are not even aware of their biases, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Explicit bias or overt racism is easy to identify and easy to correct. But when it's implicit and you're not aware of it, it's more dangerous on society as a whole. What does bias mean to you? Well, it's almost an inflexible belief about a group of people. There's certain cultures who may have not interacted. I know when I was in law enforcement, within my first year within the gang unit, I was assigned a new partner named Tad Ford, which later became close friends for over 16 years before we lost him in the line of duty. And I remember the first day he got in the car and he told me, and he was white. He said, "Hey, if I say anything wrong, just slap upside my head. I'm from the country, never been around people of color. I'm real nervous. I know I'm gonna say something stupid." He was really self-aware, and he grew up in an environment where in his community, there was a lot of bias against people of color because in his community, he lived in a rural part of the county. There was no people of color. And now he's coming to the inner city, working with a police department where we patrol a lot of inner city areas, which predominantly people of color. So he had some awareness of it, but he knew he had weaknesses also. It could be positive and negative, like I was explaining before. Sometimes our biases keep us safe, but sometimes it can have a negative impact. It's one thing to think it, but when you act upon it and impact other people, that's when it becomes a problem. And our biases also enable us to make quick decisions, and I'm gonna go further into that in a little bit, but remember, bias is based off our lived and learned experiences. So instead of having to reconstruct the wheel every time, sometimes we utilize our past experiences to decision make. It can be explicit without us even acknowledging it. It can counter our own conscious belief. I can tell you, I've had friends on both sides of the fence, people of color and people not of color, who will say they're not racist. But during the conversation, when they start expressing their beliefs, it shows their biases, and they're not even conscious of it. And so I have to go back to the conversation and start saying, okay, well, how do you know this for a fact? What have you seen in writing that's verifiable, or what proof have you seen? And so that's just how simple it is. I have a lot of people I know of color say, well, I hate racist. I'm black, and I have to explain to them, you're not racist, but you can't have a bias based off the experience you may have had with people not of color or just what you see on TV. Because they're all, just like there are white people who've never been inside a black community, there's people of color who's never been outside their own community. So the only thing they're seeing when it comes to people who are white is what they see on TV and social media. And unfortunately, what's going on today, it's even gotten worse. So the fear and mistrust has grown. Everyone has them at some level. If you look over my shoulder on top of the filing cabinet, my composition book, the first one, let's see, I've been doing research in this area for almost 4 years. And every time I catch one of my own biases, I have a thought or I say something and it's not fact-based and it's negative towards a person, place, or thing, I write it in that book. And then I educate myself. And that's the only way you're going to be able to manage it. So it's an ongoing process. And it's also necessary for survival because of my experience in law enforcement, my experience in the military, and just living life. My biases have helped me out several times in my decision-making process when in dangerous situations. So our bias is derived from how we take and process and interpret information, which I'm not going to go too deep. In the scientific aspect, it's called schemas. Short and sweet is how we take the information in, how we compartmentalize it, and how we perceive it is how we act upon it. The human brain can process approximately 11 million bits of information per second. 11 million bits. Don't seem like it. But if I tell everybody right now, sit up straight in your chair and do a 360 look around your room and then look back at the screen. In those few seconds, you see everything in that room. If I was asking you to describe that room, you're only going to describe the largest items. And I'm going to pick on Emily for a second because I can see her to my right of my screen. So if I was to ask Emily to describe your room, Emily would probably say what's to her left, what's to her right, what's in front of her. I only can see what's behind you, but she'll say a bookshelf with books. But her brain actually seen some of the titles of the books within that scan, the color of the books, approximate number of the books. So it breaks down these pieces of information. So when you say 11 million bits, really, when you start adding in all those factors, your brain is actually processing that. I know when I did some training with the interrogation team, they talk about how they can put you in a semi-sleep state and have you walk back through a process to get information. And you can get more detail when you slow your brain down to where it can actually process information accurately. But on the day-to-day average, we only actually process 40 bits per second. So out of 11 million bits of information per second, we actually only aware of 40 bits per second. In other words, our brain takes a lot of shortcuts, And that's how we live through life. That's how we were able to move effectively throughout life and not having to be so redundant on trying to figure out each detail, each process, especially when it's a day-to-day pattern. So the slow process is what we call analytical. It's conscious, slow, methodical, control, high effort, high cognitive. We rarely use that on a day-to-day basis unless we're doing some scope of work to require us to think things through a process, or we're actually self-reflecting. On average, we're in an intuitive state. It's unconscious, it's rapid, it's automatic, low effort, low cognitive awareness. That's the state we stay in majority of the time. And that's the state we utilize when we judge person, places, or things. A lot of people ask, when does it start? Well, studies have shown that around age 2 to 2.5 years of age is when we start assigning value to people, places, and things. It's through exposure, association, and the perspective that come from a variety of sources. Something simple as our social factors, our families, economic status, living situation, all of this have a great impact on our lives. That's why I want to have conversations with individuals about implicit bias or do the training or the workshops, or like I say, the discussions. I'll tell you, you're never wrong in my eyes. Now, as a researcher, I'm going to want to know, why do you feel that way? That's when I start asking you the questions, start peeling back the layers. And 99.9% of the time is usually through exposure or lived experience. It's why a person may have a negative outlook towards another individual or culture itself. So how we're raised and what we're exposed to dictates how we perceive things. And if you actually think about, even down to religion, if you was to ask a person who grew up in a strong religious community or family structure and try to hold a discussion about another religious perspective, you can truly see just how ingrained in us, how offensive it will be to them to even think outside of that scope. And I always relate back to religion because most people can really identify with that. But just to have that conversation, and sometimes as a researcher, and Ken been over to a couple of get-togethers at my house, and hopefully be able to invite all the locals that live in this area over. I like to get a bunch of people together with different backgrounds and then move around through the groups and start conversations. And when you get a diverse group of people together and you start having these type of discussions, you learn so much about each other. And I always tell everybody that's the space to grow in culturally. Find people that you can trust and that you'll have that mutual respect for, the way you can have these sometimes hard to have discussions about different perspectives. A lot of people say, well, I don't discuss religion, or I don't discuss politics, or I don't discuss this or that. But when you fail to educate yourself, whether through reading or just having the natural conversation, you're actually limiting yourself, which is only going to enhance your biases. Bias is a personal preference, does not involve prejudice, measures concepts between categories of people. In other words, when we look at a group of people, we automatically assign a bias to them based off what we've read, what we was exposed to, or what we've experienced. Stereotype is preconceived ideas, thoughts on certain races, ethnic backgrounds, fabricated and social aspects of society. see people as a certain aspect, you know, as far as like some races are considered clumsy, athletic, or hairy. It's a difference between the two. A bias is unconscious, a stereotype is pretty much conscious. Some quick data. Now, the first two subsets I'm going to talk about, it actually flip-flops, but on average, it stays how it's posted here. So I rarely do I move it around. It's right now because of the current political environment. Number 1 and 2 has actually changed positions. But so as a researcher, we have to do, before I say anything or say anything, we do what we call peer review studies, do scientific studies that's been replicated several times. And so when you want to think of the top 5 areas where implicit bias really impact people, it's normally age, then race, then weight, gender, then education. Because of the political environment right now, what's going on in society with law enforcement, actually race has moved back to the top. But as soon as this is quiet back down, it'll go back up to age. And a lot of people are like, what do you mean by that? You know, I see more issues with people of color that's experiencing systematic racism. Well, if you watch, one example I like to use is commercials. So if you look at the commercials you see today, you see more commercials with people of color in it. You see more commercials with interracial couples. And you actually have seen a few commercials for same sex. So you see the transition in society where they're saying, okay, we need to do a little bit better as how we portray this particular group or these particular groups. But the one thing that stays consistent that I have not seen any big change in is when it comes to age. Every time you see a commercial with people of age, it's either with medication, it's either dealing with refinancing your home. It's in other words, it's showing, it always illustrates an area of weakness or need of assistance. And before I started working with American Red Cross, I believe those commercials. When I seen a person over a certain age, I figured they either gonna fall and need help or need a reverse mortgage, or that's all I knew because I don't really hang around with people past a certain age. It wasn't until I started working with American Red Cross, the retired is active. I've been on a couple of deployments and I've done a couple of things locally with Red Cross, and a large percentage of your volunteers are retirees who are quite active. And when I look over, when I start feeling myself get tired, I look over my shoulder, I'm like, well, I can't slow down now because my senior there is running circles around me. So that's the one space consistently you don't really see a lot of change in how we market people over a certain age. And that's why age is always going to stay to the top, because as a society, we devalue them to a certain extent. Then, like I said, race, then weight, gender, and education. Studies show that an individual who is at least 6 feet tall earns average approximately $166,000 more during a 30-year career. Now, when I read this study, I went and got me some lifts to put in my shoes, hoping it would help me out in my pay increase. Because society as a whole sees success as a white male at least over 6 feet. Previous performance evaluations demonstrated where within the school system, due to lack of cultural competency, white teachers had a more negative impact on students. Despite the fact that a lot of these teachers in these studies graduated from prestigious colleges, could have went anywhere and made lots of money, but chose the inner city area, feeling they needed their area of expertise, that they can go in there and help. But because of their implicit bias and lack of understanding on how to interact with inner city kids of color, when they had observers go in and watch during the study, and when a white child, a child not of color, was asked a particular hard question, the teachers coached him. When a person of color was asked a similar question that was hard, the teacher, when they seen them struggling, instead of coaching to assist them to work through the process, they just cut the questioning off and gave them the answer. Because in their mind, they felt they was disadvantaged and they didn't want to embarrass them. But what that did over a period of time was made the kids of color feel that it wasn't smart enough. And so they actually had because of their implicit bias, not knowing, went to the school with good intent, because of their implicit biases, they actually had a negative impact on the students. And then we also see it in medicine. There are several studies show where doctors, because of their lack of understanding of inner city communities, with good intentions, had negative impact on the patients. Also, at one time, due to a study that was released, because of that particular study, they now have raised the level of guidelines or requirements before you can publish research now. Because one study, I think it was conducted over in Europe, and it started over in the United States, but they actually did a complete study over in Europe where it was said that people of color was more prone to become addicted to narcotics, and we had a higher pain tolerance. Never been scientifically proven. That was just the interpretation of people of color, but it goes all the way back towards the slavery days. And so a lot of doctors, because they didn't want to bring drug problems in Black communities, would not actually give them certain types of medication and stuff. And how they actually was able to identify some of these areas, they had individuals go in to see doctors with similar symptoms. And when they went in to see the doctor, one white, one Black, they was managed differently and stuff. And that was replicated through multiple research cases. Studies have indicated also that African-American borrowers are targeted for high risk loans. As a person of color with great credit, I can get a loan quicker than I can get a business loan. A bank will loan me money for a car or for a home faster than they would loan me one for a business, because they don't see people of color as great entrepreneurs. Also, with females, coded words within the workforce have a negative impact. They also always referred to as supportive, responsible, understanding, responsive, where they use coded words for men, where they're analytical, they lead, they're ambitious, challenging, objective, things of that nature. Those type of terminologies, when you're describing an individual who may be up for leadership, can greatly impact how the people have to make the decision whether they're going to promote you or not. And so even when I read this here study, I have a lot of females who work for me. I started being more self-conscious because just by the sheer nature, my family is mostly females. So I was taught to have great respect for females. So when I referred to females who worked when I was a commander in law enforcement and in the private sector, I always used these coded words, soft term words, because I didn't want them to sound manly, not realizing the impact it may have on them when other leaders look at them for possible promotion. To this very date, female leaders still get paid at about a 32 to 37% lower rate, even despite the fact they outperform a lot of their male counterparts. So implicit bias is still floating there within the space of gender and race. Just unfortunately, when it comes to race, it's having a harsher impact as far as freedom within the justice system and also our lives when interacting with law enforcement. If you ever want to test your space within implicit bias or where you stand within society, I suggest everybody go take the IAT test, the implicit association test. It was a test designed by Harvard. To this very date, it's about the closest you can get for accuracy. I got on the fourth point there, or you can just put in Google implicit bias IAT or implicit Harvard, and it'll pop right up. It covers everything. Gender, sexuality, religion, race, everything. And I take it at least twice a year just to gauge myself in different areas. And I'm always amazed when I identify how many biases I have subconsciously without even realizing it. The great thing about this test is, if you think back when I was talking about how brain processes information, how the test is set up, it's rapid response. So it's intuitive, not analytical. Because we know as a society, if somebody asks us a question about race, gender, sexuality, or religion, we're going to stop. Well, the people with common sense anyway are going to stop, think, and then answer and stuff. So that means we're being more analytical to make sure we're giving the correct answer for the type of environment we're in. Where with IAT test, it's rapid response. And to tell you just how accurate it is, to this very day, when they test individuals within the Black community, they still rate their own race at a lower rate because of their exposure, what they see around them, what they see on TV. if you see it enough and it's reinforced, you actually start believing, despite the fact that it's actually not statistically true. On one of the test questions, when it refers to crime, people of color still rate themselves higher, at a higher level, to most likely commit a crime, when statistically it's the other way around. Not saying that whites are worse than blacks, it's just more of them. So it's statistically impossible, only 13% of the population commit more crimes. But because of what they see on TV and what they hear, they actually believe it. So when I'm working with a community of color in this type of training or discussion, I always tell them, if we perceive ourselves this way, why are you surprised when people not of color perceive us this way? So it's our job to educate. So to manage your biases, some quick key points to remember. The first thing you have to do is first understand what implicit bias is. If you didn't grasp that during this discussion, I encourage you to Google it. Then start becoming more self-aware. I cringe when I hear people talk. I love talking about politics. I'm an independent, so I can complain about both sides. But when I start hearing some of my friends and colleagues saying left wing, right wing, I say, you're showing your biases. We know we're either Democrat, Republican, or independent. But even something that simple, because when you put that tone onto that title, it automatically becomes negative. Even with your vocabulary on how you take in, say certain things about people of color or people of not of color, like, just like I have to tell my white friends, you can't say all black people, all Hispanics. I have to constantly remind my friends that's black, you can't say all white people, and stuff. So it's an ongoing process of trying to avoid microaggressions by saying all and collectively grouping everybody together. Visual positive interaction throughout the workspace. When businesses ask me to come and do training for them, the first thing I do is try to walk all the floors and all the hallways. And then we have that discussion. Do your place of work actually welcome all? If you go into a business and every photo you see in there is people not of color, do the people of color feel comfortable or feel like they're part of that culture? Include equal gender and race in your decision-making process. If you're part of an organization that's making decisions that's going to impact the organization itself and the people they're serving, if your board do not reflect the organization itself or the community you're serving, there's a problem. You need to make sure you have everybody equal within the gender and the race and decision-making process. No one group can decide what's best for all groups. Encourage people to recognize the implicit bias and hold each other accountable. Like I told you, I'm always holding my friends accountable, and I tell them to do me the same way. And when you hear me say something that may not be true and it may sound like my implicit bias, call me on it. Just say, well, what make you think that way? Or what make you perceive that? Engage in educational opportunities, such as what we're doing today, just having this conversation. Feel free to always reach out to me for a private conversation, to ask questions. I do a lot of training here in Perrysburg and exchanging the phone numbers. And I think for the first several months that I did the city of Perrysburg, I got inundated with questions of people trying to figure out whether they were racist or not. And I can proudly tell you that I had to tell them, nope, that's not racist. And I probably thought the same thing too if that person said that to me and stuff. So just having those conversations, having that person you feel comfortable with. I do it all the time. If it's something that I see that I have a negative outlook to, I usually go to that gender or that race and say, hey, for some strange reason I feel this way and I've tried to read up on it, but I still have this here perception. Can you please educate me? And I tell everybody in this meeting tonight, feel free to reach out to me. I tell all my white friends and relatives, you always want to have that one black person in your life where you can go ask the black guy if you have a question and stuff. We'll tell you the truth and stuff. And we don't represent all black people neither. And so I'm going to tell you my perception and my lived experiences. Get to know your colleagues and peers prior to making any negative judgments. When I do the group discussions, I always ask everybody, say by show of hands, how many of you all have a person that you call a friend that's a person of color? And they all raise their hands. Okay, keep your hands up. I said, so how many of you all consider them a close friend? About half keep your hands up. I said, how many of y'all had them come over your house and break bread at your dinner table? Then I lose most of my hands. See, having a work friend is not having a friend. You're forced to be within that proximity, so you're going to get along and communicate because you're in that proximity. So I always encourage people to, if you don't feel comfortable bringing them in your home, at least go out to eat and break bread together and have those casual conversations. Just my experience just here locally with when I first moved to this area and with Ken. You know, me and Ken became good friends. We started off working together with the American Red Cross, me working there as a volunteer on projects with Ken. But through the process, we broke bread together, we eat lunch together, and we plan events with the family together. And I've learned so much from him just through casual conversation and what we see going on in the world today. And I'm hoping he learned the same from me. Be open to the idea that diversity is a great thing, and that many are ways in life in which can be lived, that can be done. In other words, your perspective is not always the right perspective. Your way is not always the right way. There's multiple approaches to any way of doing any one thing, and just try to diversify your way of seeing things. To me, I thought I knew a lot. My family's intermixed. My first daughter is biracial. So I've thought I knew everything about every other culture. It wasn't until I started doing this research and educating myself that I realized how little I knew. Be confident when addressing implicit bias. You'll never hear me yell at somebody or be negative or make them feel uncomfortable. If anything, I may pull them to the side and say, hey, I noticed you said this here, and I was kind of wondering, how did you come across with that perception? And kind of walk them through and stuff. And then I start sharing information to counter their perception and start giving them facts and say, hey, and don't just believe me. Go and search and read this here book, or go to Google, not regular Google, Google Scholar. Google Scholar is all peer-reviewed scientific information, and just educate yourself and never debate perspectives or experiences. If Emily tell me that she feel that if she go into a community of color after dark, that she may get robbed, guess what? Her perception to me is understandable, because my mindset's going to be either she's seen something or experienced something to make her feel that way. All I can do at that point is tell her, well, you know, in certain neighborhoods, I feel the same way too. But don't let that dictate on if you get invited to a function within that community. If you don't feel safe going there alone, have the community member invite you to walk to bring you in and stuff. That way it can help you manage that bias and help you get past that part. So some of the questions I always tell people to ask themselves for self-reflection: who are your closest 3 friends? What similarities do we share? Race, social class. So even within a culture that's all white, you have biases. Most people are going to assimilate with people who are just like them, even to the point of education and wealth. When I got my Ph.D., I noticed a lot of my colleagues only interacted with other people with Ph.D.s or higher education. Fortunately, I got mine later in life, so I can move within all circles, because I even get tired of hearing this talk sometimes and stuff, you know, and stuff. But ask yourself that question: your 3 close friends, are they just like you? And if they are, expand out, diversify a little bit. Can you name 5 friends who are different from you on multiple levels? Religious, political, and the big thing is political. I've gained friends since this here over these past 4 years, because I forced those hard conversations. But a lot of people have lost friends, and there are studies showing now a lot of divorces have resulted because of political beliefs. And so people now are starting to assimilate with individuals who are like-minded, just like them. So I challenge you to see if you can identify 5 people you know who are close in your inner circle that differ from you on multiple levels. If you cannot, expand it so you can educate yourself. What environment do you find yourself most comfortable in? In other words, do you feel comfortable when you're in a room with other people who don't look like you? Have you ever exposed yourself to that? I can tell you, when Dean Neese with the Toledo Rotary Club invited me for the first time, we was actually working on a project together with the American Red Cross. And through conversation, he invited me to the Rotary. And the first day I walked into that meeting, you know, Toledo Rotary is the 10th largest in the world. I went in that room and it was a bunch of older white males. And after the meeting, several stayed behind and tried to hold a conversation. And I was trying to think of every way I can to get out of there. And when I got in my vehicle and was driving back to work, I was like, wow, that was biased. Why did I have these people here, you know, have a vision and belief like I do? They was real welcoming. And then I realized, you know, despite, you know, being raised in a culture of diversity, I'd never been around that many white older business people at one time. So I forced myself to go back to a couple more meetings so I felt comfortable. I had to fight my own biases, and that's only just a couple of years ago. When you picture a successful person in your mind, who do they look like? In other words, could you picture a person outside of your race or gender or culture as a successful person? And when was the last time you remember letting something slide that could be racist or prejudiced or discriminatory? In other words, when you're around a bunch of friends or family members and they said something that you know about another culture or a race or a gender that wasn't true, did you speak up? As we all know, and I'll run through this real quick, implicit bias is a major contributor to racial and ethnic injustice. A lot of people are trying to apply racism to what we're seeing in the law enforcement community and to a lot of things, but it's not. The research I've conducted, additional research following my research, is more dealing with implicit bias than outright racism. Understand the causes to help to diminish discriminatory behaviors and create a world of racial equality, and justice. Understanding is the key word. Immersing yourself in other cultures, learning more about other cultures, and educating yourself is the only way you're going to get rid of it. We can go down this road of policies, we can go down this road of reform, but the bottom line is it's all about human behavior. The only way you're going to change that human behavior is by educating yourself, developing understanding. See, you only can have empathy for something if you understand it. And if you don't have an understanding, you cannot have empathy. And without empathy, hate comes natural. The world is very diverse. We're seeing that now. I tell a lot of my friends when they talk about these protests, and especially my friends of color, when they're saying, well, all white people, you gotta stop that. I said, have you ever been to Oregon or Washington State? Well, I have. I said, there's not a lot of us up there. I said, watch those protests. You'll count more Black Lives Matter t-shirts than you see black people. I said, so it's not all white people. That Oregon's got the record right about now for protests. And that's because in our community, we call it being woke. I said, there's a lot of white people now who are woke. They're seeing what they see and they do not like it. And I have to educate them on how Black Lives Matter started. Now, has it been perverted a little bit? Yes. I said, but throughout history, and this is another conversation later on a sidebar, but throughout history, people of color realize we're only a small part of the population. So we try to develop ways on how to let the world know what's going on so we can get that support. And the Black Lives Matter hashtag was part of that process. It was a slogan they put out there to let people not of color know, hey, this is what's going on. And you're seeing a result of that. A lot of people are getting anxious right now, but I can tell you within the research circles, the circles of friends, through conversation when doing training in this space, a lot of people are tired of what they're seeing and they won't change. And so I think we're going to take another big leap towards that process and that change. And that's where the diversity comes in. You know, we're in an interconnected society and you're seeing us move forward. And the key thing is to understand that we live in a complex world. So the faster we educate ourselves and each other, the faster we get through this here process. So I'm hoping I increased your awareness a little bit tonight without boring you to death too much. I hope I've given you a little more knowledge. And I hope through the awareness and knowledge, I've increased your capacity of developing skills on how to manage your biases. And if everybody give me a thumbs up when I hit those 3 keys, mission accomplished. Thank you. Any questions?
Question. And this is related to the strategies. For instance, my parents live in very rural New York State. They don't have any diversity in their area. It's all, you know, white people, mostly farmer, mostly poor rural folks. Do you have any strategies or tips that, like, for instance, if my mom makes a comment about, I don't know, whatever, related to, you know, her biases, and I don't think it's intentional racism, but as you said, it's, you know, biases. Is there a good way to help you know, push her towards increasing her understanding?
So when it comes to the older generation, because they lived experiences, remember our biases develop over our lived experience. So the older you are, the kind of harder it is to pivot.
Yeah.
So I will start off small. And it can be something simple as if she, it depends on what she's saying. If it's something related towards crime. The FBI statistics is available on the internet. You know, so you can actually pull the data that says, well, you know, they're really a little over 13% of the population. And so it's statistically impossible to commit the most crimes. I mean, even if every person of color committed a crime, it still couldn't be a majority. So just sharing information such as that nature, making sure it's not a debate or argument, because if you make the person feel bad about it, they digress. Or it can be something simple as, if you know there's something particular she like far as music or any kind of cultural thing that she enjoys, introduce a person of color who's excelled in that.
Oh, okay. That's
They, hey,
great.
did you know? It's like with me, I have uncles who are in their 60s and 70s who grew up, originally born in New York, and who grew up during some of the trying times in the 50s and 60s, and had the black fist, you know, picture in their room. And in their mind, even though we have white people in our family, the majority of white people are racist. And so every time I go home and visit, you know, I'll take and spark a conversation. And so then I hit them with data. You know, they're very proud of Barack Obama. So I use that as a pivot point. And I'll tell them, I said, you know, they talk about, you know, him being elected and some of the challenges he went through. And I said, you know, I said, hey, did you know that for the first time, 88% of the people of color turned out to vote? They said, yeah, we got there and voted. We got in office. I said, But you know, at the time, it was only over 14% of the population. So it's statistically impossible for us to put them in office. Did you know that it was the middle income white female and people with higher degrees actually pushed them over, not once, but twice. And that they can't dispute that. It's a common interest. And we carry the conversation from that part. And so just something simple as that, just sharing some data, but not being too aggressive and helping to make that slow pivot, because it's kind of, you know, I'm not assuming, but if you have a religious belief, and if I was to tell you, God didn't exist, well, it ain't gonna be a one-time conversation. It may be a long process. So I always use a religious, I know people really embrace that. So I tell them, what if somebody's trying to make you believe God didn't exist? That's gonna be a long process. So you got to kind of be the same way, because what a lot of people do is once they start realizing you're right, they're gonna go into self-guilt. And that's what you got to help them understand, it's not your fault.
Okay.
It's not your fault, because I share, you know, when I do the training, I share my faults. And I can tell you, and I can tell this group comfortably, if you'd have asked me up to 3 years after I retired from law enforcement, who would most likely kill me in the line of duty, I'd have told you a young black male, because of my lived experiences and what I've heard, despite the fact that since they started collecting data on officers killed in line of duty, more officers have been killed in line of duty by whites versus blacks. Not saying whites are more violent, it's just more whites than it is blacks and stuff. And I was shocked when I started doing my research and having to educate for my research and my Ph.D. that when I seen that data, I was like, wow, for over 20 some years, I believed that. So every time I drew my weapon, how much did my implicit bias have on my actions? And I'm a person of color. So that's why I'm not surprised a person who don't look like me feel that way, because I felt that way because of my lack of information understanding.
Excellent presentation, Marvin. This obviously what we're facing now. You make it sound hopeful. What I wanted to ask you what do you think about Jamie Dimon and J.P. Morgan and this $14 billion that they have dedicated to minority loaning?
Yes. So actions like that is actually taken. And remember, I talked about the loans and some of the challenges we face as people of color who want to enter the business sector and create a business for our own communities. That's going to help a lot. That's going to help a lot. It's going to give a lot of opportunities, if well implemented, to young entrepreneurs. And with that, it'll give us more power within our own communities. Because I tell anybody, you know, I'm now working on a project. ProMedica is putting a little over $2 million into Junction area here in Toledo. And so the one great thing about that is the collaboration. And so I've gotten with some of the smaller nonprofits in that community and say, hey, listen, Big Brother's going to help you with the grants. We're going to help you oversee the grants, but I want you to run the grants. You know, I want to teach you on how to improve your community. And what JP Morgan and other businesses are doing is a great thing. It's putting the power back in the community. And it's almost like we say in the Bible about teaching a man to fish versus giving him fish.
And I don't want to hog questions here, but as follow-up based on that, Big Brothers Big Sisters, when I was involved, both Sue and I were involved in Big Brothers Big Sisters in Lorain County. I was on the board there. Well, and Sue was a big sister for a number of years. Anyway, what I found, and I'm sure it's the same in Toledo, we could not get Black Big Brothers, and is so needed. Why do you think they're so reluctant and we can't find those role models?
Okay, so they're out there. And so I had the same problem. So how I got involved with Big Brothers and Big Sisters is I made a promise to myself after doing my research and realized how much damage I did to my own community, that I was going to dedicate 40% of my time and my business into repairing some of that damage. And how I got involved with Big Brothers and Big Sisters was supporting them on some of their projects. And then when they was going through a change, I came on as a interim CEO to help them right the ship, and then end up signing a 3-year agreement to where my salary goes back into the organization. So I don't take one dime. My pay goes right back to the organization to help the organization, because that way I can get a hold of some of these kids in the inner city and keep them out of the system and away from officers like I used to be and uneducated and stuff, thinking I'm doing the right thing by cleaning the streets, but not knowing the negative impact I was having. And so I had the same problem. So I took a step back and said, what model do Big Brothers and Big Sisters as a whole use to recruit? And if you look at the areas they recruit, they're not hitting the areas of the people who have those capabilities. So I started going out to the colleges. I started going out to the businesses that have minorities in them and start recruiting there. Because if you're in the inner city and you're working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, you don't have time to mentor anybody. And then, you know, reach out to some of these other businesses who have people of color in high-level positions that have the flexibility. They didn't even know anything about Big Brothers and Big Sisters and what we do. So I started doing targeted recruitment.
Marvin, thank you for this this lecture. This is very good. Gives me a lot to think about. I'm actually a minority where I live because I live in Guatemala. So this topic is always at the forefront of my mind as I move around in society here and think about how people think about me, whether it be positive because I'm an American, or whether it be negative because maybe they only look at me as money and think I have lots of money, and maybe that's the only reason they want to reach out to me, or, you know, or be friends with me or whatever, and vice versa, and how I see the people around me. I used to be very prejudiced against Latinos growing up because of the gang members at my high school outside of Chicago and things like that, and so I made that association, and now my world's upside down as I live here and I married a Latina and all that. So anyways, very good information, gives me a lot to think about. So thank you.
And you know, Howard, thank you for sharing that. And I always encourage people in these kind of group discussions, share your truths and stuff. Because your lived and life experiences, your lived and learned experiences pay heavy on how you perceive people and perceive things. And I could tell you, when I first left New York to go and start working with the police department down south in Mobile, Alabama, their last hanging was 3 years before I started the police department in '86. When I got there, it was actually going on trial. So during that time, when I think of Alabama as what I see on TV, right? And so when I moved down there, I didn't realize Mobile's a port city right there on the waterfront, so it's more mixed. And so my mindset when I first got down there, okay, you know what? I'm gonna show them something down here. I'm gonna take all these here racist people down here, and I'm gonna show them what a Yankee gonna change in this Mobile area. And I can tell you, for the first couple of months, when I first moved in, I had people coming over, knocking on the door, bringing me cake, cookies, some of that Southern hospitality. And initially, I was throwing away. They're trying to poison me, trying to set me up, you know. And it took me a little while to realize not everybody in Alabama is uneducated or racist and stuff. Matter of fact, you have to go in the woods and find those kind of people. I mean, it was more diversity there in Mobile than in certain areas of New York and stuff. So sometimes what you see, those lived and learned experiences, deeply impact. And I would have left Mobile if the government would have recruited me back in 2009 to come on board and do training for the special ops units. I'd have stayed there and retired there and stuff. So like you said, what you see and what you hear can dictate how you perceive, unfortunately.
Yeah, Marvin, I can definitely say I thoroughly enjoyed this, discussion that you've provided tonight. I would say I'm 29. I live out here in rural Fulton County, Northwest Ohio. And out here, it's very hard to have the discussions amongst cultural diversity and implicit bias. And I've had some of that in my classes I'm currently taking. And with the things that have happened this year with, Black Lives Matter and the protests, and I have friends of color, and we had some really deep conversations that brought me to a place that was, it was real, it was raw, it was genuine, but I think that this topic definitely should be talked about more, because there are a lot of things that me as being a white person, I don't necessarily think of. And so it's really, to have these kind of eye-opening discussions is very crucial. So I do appreciate you taking the time to discuss that. But one thing I know I struggle with out here with everything that's going on is talking about politics. It's not something I talk about. It's not something I put on social media. I will admit I'm not the most educated, but it's because I don't trust a lot of the information that's out there. It's kind of, we have a lot of people that are set on both sides and they're set in their ways. So even having a conversation is extremely difficult. And I have tried to, talk about like Black Lives Matter movements and things like that. And I've gotten completely shut down. And I'm like, at this point, I guess we'll just agree to disagree, and maybe at another time where we can provide insight from each side. But so I struggle with that. So it's hard, and I don't really know if there's tips that you have for someone, especially in a younger rural area, on how to talk about some of these sensitive topics. Quite overwhelming, to be honest with you.
I can tell, is it Kelsey?
Mm-hmm.
I can tell by your tone that it was deeply impactful to you. It means a lot to you. And you have a lot of empathy for my culture. You're frustrated because you want everybody else in your culture to feel the same way. So I always tell everybody, when you become woke, you got to give everybody else around you time to wake up too. For about 6 months, my closest law enforcement friends, when I was writing my, so your chapter 2 is your lit review. When you're doing your research, you have to learn everything about the topic. And by the time I finished, I was anti-police. I said, wow, we're some bad people, And I was calling my colleagues and friends, man, this here, and I was turning them away because I had all that information they didn't have. Like I said, if you'd asked me several years, I'd have been right along with other officers defending some of these other officers' actions because we live in that blue bubble. And so I had to slow down and find out how to let them catch up with me. So I always tell people one of the best things you can do is first listen to them, hear their say, and then slowly introduce information. You can go back to how Black Lives Matter started. And I tell everybody, it's because of the reaction people initially had to Black Lives Matter. It's kind of the original 3 young ladies who made that slogan has kind of become jaded. But it was all about letting people that look like most of the people in this here forum tonight know that, hey, we need your help again and stuff. But it's a process, and you got to work up to that point. It's not one of those conversations you can go right into, even with politics, because remember, that's very personal, a lot of people. And when you start introducing facts and truths, you got to understand you're number one, countering their lived and learned experiences. And number 2, they're having to self-reflect now. So you got to make sure you create that space where they won't really judge themselves. When Donald Trump won, I was shocked. And so I had to figure out why these states that went Democrat flipped Republican. So I took Kwame Bell, who's a comedian, but he did a special on CNN. He went to all these rural coal mining places, which I've never been to. And for 1 week, he went around asking the question. I can tell you, and Ken can tell you, I called myself a tough guy, but every night I shed a tear. You know why? Listen to those people in those rural areas talk. I understood where it was coming from because I grew up poor too. And when I heard, see, in my mind as a person of color, white people can't have problems like we have. They're white. But watching what they went through, when they showed how their town prospered when the coal mine was doing great, and how when the jobs went away, like it did in our communities, how the crime rate went up, how the drug abuse went up, how there was no hope, I could empathize. So I no longer seen a Republican or a Trump voter or a white person. I seen somebody who had my lived and learned experiences. So sometimes you may have to find that space of commonality and then build out from there. So that's why you'll never hear me say anything bad about a Trump voter, because two things that they said that stood out to me was, number one, you can go in any inner city and there's going to be some type of grant or program for people of color to help them. But all we heard during that election was shutting down coal mines. Number two, the Democrats bypassed all those states because they thought they had it in their back pocket. And they stood up for people of color, women's rights, LGBTQ, healthcare. They did not talk about all those millions of people being impacted by the coal mine being closed down. But Donald Trump did. He gave them hope. See, and if you go to business school and get your MBA, you're going to learn about two people in your ethics and in your marketing class: John Waltman of Walmart and Donald Trump. Questionable ethics, great marketers. And so through that lens, when I look through their lens and not my own, now I can kind of understand where some of the people who don't preach hate, but why they follow Donald Trump. So it's trying to create that space when you have those conversations. And just start off slow. You're already woke. They're kind of just coming out of their sleep. So you got to kind of spoon feed them a little bit.
Marvin, I had a question for you. I'm on a board of a nonprofit, and we really, recognize that we want to diversify our board. And I don't have anybody in my close work realm that I know of to invite on the board. How would you best recommend that I approach somebody and be sensitive? Like, we want to increase our board. We want different perspectives. We want different backgrounds to help us represent the organization.
You asked Claudine.
There you go. Yep. There you go. Julie, you pretty much, that's your sales pitch. So when I first got on board with Big Brothers and Big Sisters, I looked around the board, older, very few females on the board. And so I did a board assessment, and then I started strategically going after those particular type members. Now, you may get 1,000 no's initially, especially with this COVID crisis going on. But if you know you need the diversity, identify those areas of diversity and go after those people, go to local businesses, like nonprofits like Red Cross. When they have people come off those boards, try to cut some of the ones, I have, Ken's a good friend of mine. So at some point I may say, Ken, can you connect me with some of your board members? I want to see who's about to come off your board. Maybe I can recruit them to come over here to Big Brothers and Big Sisters. Just network with other nonprofits, because everybody have a term limit, but reach out to those local businesses in your area and go and say, hey, listen, we need more females on our board. And I thought maybe you'll be a good candidate. Can you refer me to somebody? Or we need somebody of color, because we want to make sure we have a voice. We want our board to reflect our community. So just saying that alone will make them want to step up or either refer somebody. And I'm glad to hear you're thinking that perspective too. So I'm having that same challenges